Maya Vance sat in the absolute stillness of death row, her hazel eyes fixed on the cold steel of her cell door as she made a request that silenced the entire Colorado State Penitentiary. She didn't want a priest or a lawyer, she wanted to see Aries, the K-9 partner she'd been forced to leave behind the night her life was stolen by a frame-up. This wasn't a plea for mercy, but a final, desperate connection to the only soul who knew her innocence in a world that had already signed her death warrant. Before we reveal the chilling truth that Aries uncovered the moment he entered that prison, hit that subscribe button to join our community and stay for the end of this incredible journey. Comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far Maya's story travels. The radiator in the east wing hissed, but the heat never reached the stone floor where Maya Vance sat. She was 29 years old, a woman whose career as an FBI logistics coordinator had been dismantled by a coworker's greed and a mountain of planted evidence. Her blue inmate uniform felt like a shroud. "Turner, Vance, whatever your name is today," a guard grunted, his boots echoing like hammer blows against the concrete. "Warden's coming. Stand up." Warden Malcolm Reeves appeared, a man of granite and silver hair who had long ago traded his compassion for the rigid safety of protocol. He stared through the bars at the woman the state of Colorado was preparing to kill. "Protocol requires me to ask for your final request," Reeves said, his voice a flat, dead rasp. "A meal? A phone call? We can provide a priest if you need to confess." Maya lifted her head. Her face was translucent under the fluorescent lights, but her hazel eyes were sharp with a fire that hadn't been extinguished by months of betrayal. "I don't have anything to confess, Warden," Maya whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice. "And I don't want your food." "Then what?" Reeves asked, his eyebrows narrowing. "Don't waste my time. The clock is ticking." "I want to see Aries," she said, her hands trembling so violently she had to clench them into fists. "My German Shepherd. My K-9 partner. I want to see him one last time." Reeves paused, the air in the corridor suddenly heavy. He had heard men beg for their mothers, for whiskey, for one more sunrise, but he had never heard a condemned woman ask for a dog. "A dog?" Reeves repeated, his voice wavering with a rare flicker of surprise. "You're facing the needle, and you want a dog in my prison?" "He was the only good thing in my life," Maya said, her gaze unblinking. "He's the only one who knows who I really am." Reeves reached into his coat, pulling out the thick file that documented Maya's supposed crimes. As he flipped through the pages of falsified embezzlement reports, a photograph fluttered to the floor. He bent down, his gloved fingers brushing the glossy paper. The image showed a younger, vibrant Maya kneeling in the snow, her arms wrapped around a German Shepherd puppy with oversized paws and amber eyes. The joy in her face was a haunting contrast to the hollowed-out woman in the cell. Reeves stared at the photo, his jaw tightening so hard the muscles in his neck stood out. "No," he muttered, his voice barely audible, as if he were arguing with a ghost. "It can't be." "Warden?" Maya asked, noticing the sudden shift in his demeanor. "Is something wrong?" Reeves didn't look at her. He looked haunted, his icy gray eyes clouding with a memory he had tried to bury years ago. He shoved the photo back into the folder and turned on his heel without another word. The night of Maya's arrest flashed through her mind, the screaming sirens, the tactical boots thudding on her apartment floor, and Aries. He had been 5 years old then, a powerful 90-pound machine of black and tan fur. He had leapt between her and the officers, his bark a thunderous roar of protection. "Aries, no. Stay down," she had screamed as 3 officers struggled to restrain him. They had drugged him, dragging his unconscious body away while she was hauled off in handcuffs. Now, miles away at a ranch outside the city, Aries was living a life of quiet grief. He had been adopted by Carl Benson, a retired Army sergeant who understood the weight of a soldier's soul. Carl watched the dog every evening. Aries wouldn't play with the other rescues, he would just walk to the edge of the fence and stare toward Denver, his ears flat, his body filled with a longing that no amount of kindness could heal. "You're still looking for her, aren't you?" Carl would say, his hand resting on the dog's head. Aries would only let out a soft, broken whine. The knock at Carl's door came on a morning so cold the air felt like glass. 2 state officials stood on his porch, their breath rising in white clouds. "Sergeant Benson?" Officer Collins asked, flashing a badge. "We're here about the German Shepherd." "Hunter, I mean, Aries. What's happened?" Carl asked, his hand gripping the doorframe. "If you're here to take him back to a shelter, you can turn around right now." "It's not that," the official, Lisa Warren, said softly. "The owner, the woman on death row. She's made a final request. She needs to see him." Carl's expression froze. He looked back at Aries, who was curled by the heater, his amber eyes suddenly wide and alert as if he understood the conversation. "He never forgot her," Carl whispered, his voice cracking. "But taking him into a prison? To say goodbye before they—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "It's her last wish, Sergeant," Warren said. Carl looked at Aries, whose entire body was now trembling, not from the cold, but from a sudden, visceral instinct. The dog knew. He was already moving toward the door, his tail low, his focus absolute. Back at the penitentiary, the visitation chamber was being prepped like a combat zone. 4 armed guards in tactical vests stood in the corners, their hands resting on their holsters. They weren't afraid of Maya, they were afraid of the raw, unpredictable emotion that was about to explode in the room. Maya was led in, her wrists confined by a short chain that rattled with every hesitant step. Her breathing was shallow, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Sit there, Vance," Officer Hughes ordered, his voice lacking its usual edge of cruelty. The heavy steel door on the far side of the room groaned open. Aries entered. For 3 seconds, the world stopped. The dog froze, his head tilted, his amber eyes scanning the harsh fluorescent glare until they landed on the woman in the blue uniform. "Aries?" Maya choked out, her knees buckling. The dog lunged. He nearly ripped the leash from the deputy's hands, his claws scraping desperately against the polished tile. He didn't bark, he let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. Maya sank to the floor, her cuffed hands reaching out to bury her fingers in his thick fur. Aries pressed his forehead against her chest, his body shaking with a violent, desperate relief. "Oh God, Aries, you came," Maya sobbed into his neck. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I left you." The guards, men and women hardened by years of witnessing the worst of humanity, looked away. Officer Hughes clenched his jaw, blinking rapidly against the sudden sting in his eyes. But then, the atmosphere shifted. Aries suddenly stiffened. His uncontrolled joy vanished, replaced by a rigid, terrifying tension. He pulled back from Maya's embrace, his ears flattening against his skull. A soft, low growl rumbled deep in his chest. "Aries? What is it?" Maya asked, wiping tears from her face, her voice trembling. The dog didn't look at the guards. He wasn't focused on the exit. He began to circle Maya, his nose lowering toward her uniform, sniffing frantically at her chest, just above her heart. His growl deepened, turning into a sharp, anxious bark. He began to paw at her sternum, his claws catching on the fabric of her inmate's shirt. "Easy, boy. Back off," the deputy shouted, tugging on the leash. But Aries wouldn't move. He barked again, a commanding, desperate sound that echoed off the cinderblock walls. He nudged Maya's chest with increasing urgency, his eyes blazing with a protective fury that no one understood. Maya placed her hand over the spot where Ares was clawing. Suddenly, her face drained of all color. She felt it, a faint, irregular flutter inside her chest, a jagged rhythm that didn't belong. "Warden!" Officer Hughes yelled, seeing Maya slump forward. "Something's wrong. Get the medic in here now." Ares stood over her, baring his teeth at the approaching guards, his body a living shield. He knew something they didn't. The state was planning to take Maya's life in a week, but Ares had just sensed that her heart was failing her right now. The reunion that was supposed to be a final goodbye had just turned into a race against a clock no one knew was running. The cold in the visitation room suddenly felt heavy, like a shroud settling over Maya's shoulders as she collapsed into Ares's thick fur. Officer Hughes didn't hesitate, his boots thundering across the tile as he signaled the emergency protocol. "Get medical in here. Now," he roared, his voice cracking with an urgency that bypassed all prison hierarchy. Ares refused to budge, his powerful frame positioned as a living barricade between Maya and the guards, his growl vibrating through the floor like a warning from the deep. Through the blur of her fading vision, Maya saw the steel door slam open and Dr. William Harris rush inside, his rectangular glasses nearly sliding off his nose. The doctor knelt beside her, his hands steady despite the chaos, but Ares snapped his jaws, a sharp, metallic click that stopped Harris in his tracks. "I'm helping her, boy. I'm helping her," Harris shouted, raising his palms in a desperate plea for trust. Ares locked eyes with the doctor for a fraction of a second, reading the man's intent before reluctantly sinking back onto his haunches, though his muscles remained coiled like a hair trigger. Harris pressed his stethoscope against Maya's chest, his face hardening into a mask of professional dread. "She's in severe cardiac distress," he muttered, loud enough for the guards to hear, his voice carrying the weight of a death sentence before the needle could even be prepped. "Her heart is failing. If we don't move her in the next hour, she's gone." Warden Reeves stood at the viewing window, his tall figure backlit by the harsh fluorescent glare, watching the scene with a gaze that finally began to fracture. He wasn't seeing a prisoner anymore, he was seeing the woman in the photograph, the one who had once known joy, now slipping away in a room built for punishment. "Warden, your orders," Hughes yelled, looking up at the glass. Reeves didn't answer immediately, his jaw tightening as the ghosts of his own past seemed to crowd the small observation booth. Then, with a sharp, decisive nod, he grabbed the intercom. "Ready the transport. She goes to Denver Health. And the dog stays with her." The news of the death row inmate and the K-9 who sensed her heart failing didn't stay within the prison's stone walls, it leaked out into the Denver streets like wildfire. Outside the gates, the crowd began to swell, people wrapped in heavy wool coats and scarves, their breath rising in thick white clouds against the gray sky. Pastor Aaron Wells stood at the front, his long coat buttoned to his chin, his voice leading a soft chant that grew into a roar of demand for mercy. "Justice with mercy," they cried, the sound echoing off the penitentiary's iron gates as news cameras swiveled to capture the shimmering snow falling over the protesters. Inside the ambulance, the air was sterile and cramped, filled with the rhythmic beep of monitors and the low hum of medical equipment. Lena Morris, a paramedic who had seen too much grief to be easily moved, watched in silence as Ares wedged himself beside the stretcher, his head pressed firmly against Maya's trembling arm. "He knows she's scared," Lena whispered, her fingers adjusting the oxygen mask on Maya's face while she watched the German shepherd's fierce, protective eyes. The ride was a blurred gauntlet of flashing lights and icy roads, but Ares never shifted his weight, acting as a stabilizer for the woman the world had tried to discard. When they reached the hospital, the chaos intensified, nurses and security guards moving in a practiced dance of urgency. Thomas Avery, a broad-shouldered security guard with a fatherly softness in his eyes, stepped forward to stop Ares at the threshold of the operating room. "She's in the best hands now, boy," he said, his voice a low rumble as he crouched to meet the dog's gaze. Aries whimpered, a sound so hollow and desperate it made the surrounding staff pause in their tracks, but he finally sat, his amber eyes glued to the swinging doors as they closed him out. Hours crawled by like decades in that sterile hallway, the snow continuing to pile up against the windows while Aries paced in tight, obsessive circles. Suddenly, the doors swung open, and Dr. Julia Sanderson emerged, her short dark hair mussed and her surgical mask hanging from one ear. She looked at the officers and then down at the dog who had been the talk of the surgical floor. "The surgery was successful," she announced, her voice calm but lacking its usual surgical coldness. "She's stabilized." Aries let out a single, sharp bark, a joyous explosion that echoed through the quiet corridor, making even the sternest officers crack a smile. But the victory was short-lived as a man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped into the light of the hallway, a briefcase in one hand and a look of grim determination on his face. It was Marcus Hale, a defense lawyer known for his relentless pursuit of the truth, his sandy hair slightly damp from the storm. "I've seen the footage from the visitation room," Marcus said, looking at the guards. "And I've seen the autopsy report of the man she supposedly killed. Things don't add up." Maya awoke near dawn, her vision a hazy landscape of white light and rhythmic clicking. The first thing she felt wasn't the pain in her chest, but the familiar, coarse texture of Aries's fur against her hand. He was resting his head on the edge of the bed, his breathing a soft, steady rhythm that matched her own. "You're here," she breathed, her voice a ghost of a whisper. Aries nudged her palm, a soft whine escaping him as if he were telling her the fight was only beginning. Marcus Hale entered the room, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the morning light. "Maya, I've been combing through your logistics logs from the FBI," he said, sitting in the hard plastic chair beside her bed. "The embezzlement scheme wasn't just a frame-up, it was a distraction. Someone was moving more than money through your department." Maya tried to sit up, but the weight of the surgery pinned her down. "I told them," she gasped. "I told them the numbers didn't match." Marcus leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, intense frequency. "They're not just going to let you walk away because you survived a heart attack. The governor suspended the execution, but the conviction still stands." He pulled a folder from his bag, showing her a series of flagged emails she had never seen before, emails sent from her account to a high-ranking official she had never met. "Daniel Price," Maya muttered, the name of her coworker tasting like ash in her mouth. "He was the one who handled the overrides." Aries suddenly stood, his ears pointing toward the door, a low, warning rumble starting in his throat. The sound of heavy footsteps approached the room, not the rhythmic pace of nurses, but the sharp, synchronized strike of tactical boots. Marcus stood, his jaw set, as the door opened to reveal Warden Reeves and two state officials Maya didn't recognize. "The medical stay is over, Hale," one of the officials said, his olive skin tight across his cheekbones. "She returns to the penitentiary tonight." Aries bared his teeth, a silent, terrifying promise of violence that made the officials hesitate at the threshold. "Would you like me to proceed?" The tension in the hospital room became a physical weight as Marcus Hale stepped between the bed and the state officials, his hands raised not in surrender, but in a calculated challenge. Aries's growl deepened, a primal vibration that seemed to shake the very four stands, his amber eyes locked onto the man who represented the machine that had crushed Maya's life. "You can't take her back," Marcus stated, his voice ringing with a cold, absolute authority that made Warden Reeves pause. "Moving her now, in this state, after a major cardiac event, is a direct violation of the governor's stay of execution." The lead official, Mark Collins, tightened his grip on his clipboard, his olive skin flushing with irritation. "The governor stayed the execution, Hale, not the incarceration," Collins snapped, but his eyes kept darting toward the bared teeth of the German shepherd. Maya felt the frantic beat of her heart, now stabilized by steel and medicine, but still vulnerable to the terror of returning to that gray, hollow cell. She reached out, her fingers catching Marcus's sleeve, her voice a ragged whisper. "Marcus, please, don't let them, not yet," she begged, the raw desperation in her tone making even the stoic Gak Rachel Kim shift her stance in discomfort. Marcus didn't look back. He was already pulling a fresh stack of documents from his briefcase, his face set in a mask of relentless focus. "Warden, I've just filed a motion for an emergency evidentiary hearing based on new discovery," Marcus announced, his eyes fixed on Reeves. "I have the logs Daniel Price thought he deleted. I have the trail of the embezzled funds leading not to Maya's account, but to an offshore shell company owned by the lead prosecutor." The room went silent, the only sound the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine and the low, warning rumble of the dog. Warden Reeves, the man carved from granite, looked at Maya, then at the dog who had saved her, and for the first time, the iron protocol he had lived by seemed to crack. "If what you're saying is true, Hale, you're accusing the entire district attorney's office of a capital conspiracy," Reeves said, his voice unusually low. Marcus didn't blink. "I'm not accusing them, Warden. I'm proving it." Suddenly, Ares's ears swiveled toward the hallway, his posture shifting from defensive to aggressive in a heartbeat. He barked, a sharp, alarming sound that wasn't directed at the men in the room, but at the door. Before anyone could react, the door burst open again, but it wasn't more guards. It was Sarah Donovan from the rescue center, her red hair wild and her glasses crooked on her nose, her face pale with fright. "They're outside," she gasped, looking at Marcus. "The protesters, the police are trying to move them back, but there are men in plain clothes. They're not cops, Marcus, they're armed and they're trying to get into the service elevator." Collins and the other state officials exchanged a sharp, guilty glance that didn't escape Maya's notice. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The people who framed her weren't going to let her have her day in court. They were here to finish what the heart attack hadn't. "Reeves, get her out of here!" Marcus yelled, grabbing the edge of Maya's bed as the sound of distant shouting and shattered glass echoed from below. The warden didn't hesitate this time. The photograph of the girl in the snow was burned into his mind, and his brother's memory wouldn't let him stand by while another life was stolen. "Hughes, Kim, secure the hallway." Reeves barked, his voice returning to its military precision. "We're not moving her to the prison. We're moving her to the secure ward in the basement." Ares lunged toward the door, his bark now a war cry as he sensed the threat approaching. Maya felt the bed lurch as Hughes and Kim grabbed the frame, the wheels screaming against the tile floor as they raced into the corridor. Hunter stayed glued to her side, his muscles rippling with every stride, his amber eyes scanning every doorway they passed. As they reached the elevators, a group of men in dark windbreakers rounded the corner, their hands moving toward the small of their backs. "Stop the bed," one of them commanded, flashing a badge that looked too new, too bright. Ares didn't wait for an order. He launched himself at the lead man, his 90-pound frame a blur of black and tan fury. The man went down with a scream, his weapon skidding across the floor as Ares locked onto his shoulder. "Ares, no!" Maya cried out, her hand reaching for him, but Hughes kept pushing the bed. "Leave him, Vance. He's buying us time." Hughes roared as they shoved the bed into the service elevator. The doors began to slide shut, and for a terrifying second, Maya thought she was losing him again. But at the last possible moment, Ares broke away from the downed man and slid through the closing gap, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on Maya. The elevator groaned as it descended, the silence inside broken only by Maya's ragged breathing and the dog's frantic whining. In the flickering light of the elevator, Maya looked at Warden Reeves. The man's stern face was covered in a thin sheen of sweat, his hand resting on his service weapon. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered, her fingers buried in Ares's fur for strength. Reeves looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of the compassion that had been buried under years of prison stone. "Because a dog like that doesn't lie, Turner," he said quietly. And because if I let them kill you, I'm no better than the people who shot my brother. The elevator doors opened into the cold, sterile basement, but instead of safety, they were met by Marcus Hale, who had taken the stairs, his face grim as he held up his phone. Maya, the governor just issued a second statement, he said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and triumph. He's not just reviewing the case. He's ordered a full state-level investigation into the FBI's regional office. Maya felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly eclipsed by a shadow moving at the end of the hall. It was Daniel Price, the coworker who had framed her, his face a mask of sweating, desperate terror as he held a small, black device in his hand. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Maya, he screamed, his voice echoing off the cinder blocks. They told me you'd just go away. They told me the needle would handle it. Ares stepped forward, a low, tectonic growl starting in his throat, his teeth bared in a silent promise of destruction. Maya looked at Daniel, the man she had once trusted as a friend, and she realized the truth wasn't just coming, it was already here, and it was as sharp as a K9's grip. The standoff in the sterile basement corridor felt like a vacuum, sucking the air out of Maya's lungs as she stared at Daniel Price, the man whose lies had nearly ended her life. Daniel's hand shook violently as he clutched the black device, his eyes darting between the armed guards and the bared teeth of Ares, the German shepherd who was now the only thing standing between him and the truth. Don't come any closer. Daniel shrieked, his voice cracking with a coward's desperation. Warden Reeves stepped forward, his hand resting on his holster, his face a mask of granite that didn't flinch at the threat. It's over, Price, Reeves said, his voice a low, lethal rumble. The governor's office has the logs. The FBI is being purged from the top down. There is no one left to protect you. Maya felt a surge of nausea as she looked at her former friend, the betrayal tasting like ash in her mouth. Ares let out a low, tectonic growl, his muscles rippling under his thick black and tan coat as he sensed the killing intent radiating from the man in front of them. I had no choice. Daniel yelled, tears of self-pity streaming down his face. They were going to kill me too. I just had to make the numbers work, and you were the perfect target, Maya. You were too honest for your own good. Maya's hands clenched the hospital bedsheet, the metal cuffs rattling against the frame, a sound that seemed to ignite Ares's protective fury. The dog barked once, a sharp, commanding sound that made Daniel stumble backward against a stack of supply crates. The device, Price. Drop it, Marcus Hale demanded, stepping into the line of fire, his sandy hair damp with sweat but his resolve unshakable. Suddenly, the heavy steel door at the far end of the hall slammed open, and a team of state tactical officers burst in, their weapon lights cutting through the gloom. Drop the weapon. Police, they roared. In the confusion, Daniel panicked, his finger twitching on the device's trigger. Ares didn't wait for a command, he lunged, a 90-pound blur of fury that bypassed the guards and went straight for the source of the threat. The sound of the struggle was a chaotic symphony of snarls and frantic shouting. Maya screamed Ares's name as the guards tackled Daniel to the floor, the black device skidding across the tile like a discarded toy. Warden Reeves moved with surprising speed, kicking the device away before pinning Daniel's arm behind his back. Ares stood over the downed man, his hackles raised, his amber eyes burning with the justice of a warrior who had finally cornered his enemy. Search him. Reeves barked to the tactical team. As the officers hauled Daniel away, the coward's bravado vanished, replaced by a sobbing confession that echoed off the cinderblock walls. Marcus Hale grabbed Maya's hand, his eyes bright with a victory that had been years in the making. He's talking, Maya. He's naming names. The prosecutor, the regional director, everyone involved in the embezzlement and the framing is going down. The air in the basement seemed to lighten, the suffocating pressure of the death sentence finally lifting from Maya's shoulders. She sank back into the hospital pillows, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps of relief. Ares returned to her side immediately, his frantic energy shifting back into a gentle, rhythmic whining as he nudged her hand with his cold muzzle. "You did it, boy," she whispered, her fingers burying themselves in his thick fur as the tears finally came, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of freedom. Even the hardened guards, Hughes and Rachel Kim, stood in silence, their professional stoicism finally cracking as they watched the bond that had rewritten a woman's destiny. But the victory wasn't complete until Warden Reeves turned back from the tactical team, a look of profound, weary peace on his face. He looked at the photograph he was still carrying in his pocket, the one of the girl and the puppy, and then at Maya. "The governor just called," Reeves said, his voice thick with an emotion he had suppressed for decades. "The conviction is vacated, effective immediately. You aren't going back to the cell, Maya. You're staying here until you're healthy, and then you're going home." The room erupted into a flurry of activity, but Maya heard none of it. She only saw Ares, his amber eyes reflecting the harsh overhead lights, his tail wagging with a slow, rhythmic joy that told her the mission was truly over. Outside the hospital, the roar of the crowd grew louder as the news of the exoneration hit the streets. People were cheering, their voices carrying through the ventilation shafts into the quiet ward. Marcus Hale looked at Maya and smiled, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the flickering monitors. "The truth rose like a storm, just like I told you it would," he said softly. Maya looked at Ares, the dog who had refused to let her die in silence, and she knew that this wasn't just an end, but a rebirth. The winter in Denver felt a little less cruel that morning, the ice beginning to melt under the first light of a justice that had been won by the loyalty of a single, extraordinary heart. The chaos of the hospital basement began to recede as the tactical team led a shattered Daniel Price away, leaving Maya in a silence that felt heavy with the weight of her new reality. Marcus Hale collapsed into the chair beside her bed, his sandy hair damp with sweat and his hands finally shaking as the adrenaline of the standoff evaporated. He looked at the monitor, where the feed of the governor's press conference was still playing on a loop, announcing a full state-level purge of the corruption that had nearly claimed Maya's life. "We did it, Maya," he whispered, his voice thick with a triumph that felt almost like grief. Maya didn't answer immediately, her fingers were buried deep in Ares's thick black and tan fur, feeling the frantic thumping of his tail against the hospital mattress. The dog let out a soft, broken whine, pressing his forehead against hers as if to verify that she was still breathing, still alive, and finally, undeniably free. The hospital room door opened quietly, and Warden Reeves stepped inside, no longer the man of stone who had first visited her cell. He held out the photograph, the one of the girl and the puppy in the snow, and placed it gently on the bedside table. "I had my team check the storage locker where your personal effects were kept," Reeves said, his voice carrying a rough, unaccustomed warmth. "Everything is being transferred to a secure location until you're discharged." Maya looked at the photo, then at the warden, realizing that his brother's memory had finally found its peace through her survival. "Thank you, Warden," she managed to say, her voice cracking like thin ice. Reeves simply nodded, a silent sentinel who had finally chosen mercy over protocol. But as the morning sun began to bleed through the hospital blinds, Marcus's phone buzzed with an urgent notification that drained the color from his face. He stood up abruptly, his eyes scanning the screen with a growing sense of dread. "Maya, the regional director of the FBI," "He didn't wait for the warrant," Marcus said, his voice dropping to an intense, jagged whisper. "He took his own life an hour ago, but before he did, he sent a mass email to the entire district office." Maya felt the air grow cold again, her hand tightening on Ares's collar. "What did it say?" she asked, her heart hammering against the new rhythm of her chest. Marcus looked at her, his expression a mix of horror and profound revelation. "It wasn't just embezzlement, Maya. They were using the K-9 transport units to move highly classified surveillance data. You weren't framed just because you were honest, you were framed because you had accidentally logged the coordinates of the server they were using to hide it all. Ares suddenly stood on his hind legs, his ears swiveling toward the ventilation duct above the bed. He let out a low, tectonic growl that made Marcus freeze in mid-sentence. "What is it, boy?" Maya asked, the old instinct of a handler flaring to life. The dog didn't bark. He began to pace the small room with a predatory focus, his nose tilted toward the ceiling. Suddenly, a soft, mechanical click echoed from the vent, followed by the faint hiss of an aerosol spray. "Out! Get her out of here now!" Marcus roared, realizing that the corruption had one last, desperate sting. Hughes and Rachel Kim burst into the room, grabbing the handles of the bed as they raced into the corridor just as the hospital's fire suppression system began to wail. They tore through the hallway, the wheels of the bed screaming against the tile, while Ares acted as a rear guard, baring his teeth at anyone who moved too close. They didn't stop until they reached the rooftop helipad, where the freezing Denver wind whipped Maya's short hair into a frenzy. A state helicopter was already idling, its rotors cutting through the falling snow like a promise of escape. Warden Reeves was there, holding the door open, his coat billowing in the downwash. "This is the only way to keep you safe until the federal purge is complete," Reeves shouted over the roar of the engines. Maya looked at the helicopter, then at Ares, who was already leaping into the cabin, refusing to let even a foot of distance grow between them. As the helicopter lifted off, the city of Denver shrank beneath them, a landscape of glittering frost and winding rivers of slush. Maya looked down at the prison she had once thought would be her tomb, and then at the dog resting his head on her lap. The amber eyes that had once watched her from a shelter cage were now bright with a warrior's peace. She realized then that Ares hadn't just saved her life in the visitation room, he had been saving her since the day she first brought him home as a pup. He was the bridge between her past and a future she had never dared to dream of. Months later, the misty rain of Seattle felt like a rebirth, a soft curtain that washed away the grit of the Colorado penitentiary. Maya stood at the edge of a rugged cliffside, wearing durable outdoor gear and waterproof boots, watching a new generation of K-9s move through a search and rescue course she had designed. Beside her, Ares trotted with a proud, measured gait, his service harness gleaming in the gray light. He was no longer a dog waiting for a ghost, he was a hero, recognized by a nation that had nearly allowed his partner to be forgotten. Marcus Hale visited often, bringing news of the final convictions and the restitution that would never truly pay for her stolen years. "You changed the system, Maya," he said one evening as they walked along the wet Seattle streets, the street lamps reflecting off puddles like scattered stars. "You and Ares proved that the truth can't be buried if someone is brave enough to keep looking for it." Maya looked at Ares, who was currently being hugged by a group of neighborhood children, his tail wagging with a slow, rhythmic joy. She knew that her story wasn't just about a wrongful sentence or a lucky medical intervention. It was about a bond that had been forged in fire and tested in the coldest of winters, a bond that had refused to die even when the whole world was telling it to walk away. As she turned back toward her home, a warm cabin tucked away in the pines, Maya felt a profound sense of gratitude for the miracle that had arrived on 4 paws. She had been a logistics coordinator who focused on numbers, but she had learned that the only calculation that truly mattered was the one of loyalty. Ares looked back at her, his amber eyes reflecting the light of the house, and in that moment, she knew they were finally, truly home. The loyalty of a dog is not just a comfort, it is a fierce, uncompromising force of nature that can rewrite destiny and prove that even in the darkest prison, love is the only truth worth fighting for.